Good evening, everyone. What a treat it is to have two of our favorite people here tonight. Mike Lupica, in the guise of Robert B. Parker's ghost, writing a Jesse Stone book for the first time, and Joe Ide, who is here to give him a hard time. I love it. So, let's see. We already know that Mike has a new book. Joe, before we start, tell us what your upcoming publication plan is.
IQ5, which is called Smoke, is coming out on February 23rd.
Fabulous. Well, keep an eye on our February calendar because Joe has kindly signed all of his books here, and we certainly hope to continue that tradition. So, Mike,
Me too.
this book is called Robert B. Parker's, but I always skip that part. So, Fool's Paradise, which is a really good name. Do you think Parker called it Paradise so he could riff around on names? I mean, he has a lot of fun.
It was funny. I hardly ever name my books. I would say less than half the time in all the books, my editor comes up with the title, but this one I came up with, and Sarah Minich, my fabulous editor, said I can't believe it was never used before, and we went with it. It's you can have so much fun with the name of that town, and so that's how Fool's Paradise came to be.
Wonderful. So, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you and admire your interrogation technique.
Okay. All right. Hello, Mike.
Good evening, Mr. Ide.
So there you are, minding your own business.
Yeah.
Publisher comes along and says, we want you to write a Robert B. Parker, Jesse Stone novel, a character beloved all over the world, millions of fans, and you've been preceded by some really excellent writers, Ace Atkins, Reed Farrell Coleman. What kind of hubris does it take to say yes to that? I can't believe it.
All right. Would you like to know how I got into what Ace calls, he's the godfather, calls the Parker sphere?
Okay.
I was, I think Barbara, I think I've told you this story. I was driving up to Vermont a few summers ago, and we were going to have a family vacation up there. And I was listening to Kate Burton, who does such a fabulous job on the audiobooks of Sonny Randall. And she did for Bob Parker, and she's now doing for my books. And when I got up there, I called Esther, my agent, and I said, how come nobody continued Sonny Randall? I mean, the Westerns got continued, obviously Spencer and Jesse Stone, and she said, I'll find out. So she called Ivan Held at Putnam. I call him my boss, or the capo de tutti capo. And he said to her, have him write a sample chapter. And I said, no, this wasn't a pitch. I have enough to do. I was just curious. I mean, Bob Parker was my friend. I love those books. I love all of his books. And Esther said, write the chapter. The next morning, I got up very early, and I wrote a chapter in Sonny Randall's voice that is essentially, almost word for word, the first chapter of Blood Feud, my first Sonny Randall. And Joe, we've talked about this. The minute I was writing, in that head, with that voice, in that attitude, on the first page, Sonny says to her buddy Spike, do I look as if I'm getting older? And Spike said, this is a trap. And she said, no, the UPS kid mammed me the other day. And Spike said, I assume you shot him. And literally, as soon as I wrote that exchange, I said, you know what? I've been reading these books since I took the Godwall manuscript off the shelf at a Brentano's, yes, on Boylston Street in Boston when I was in college.
This is what I wanted to ask you about. You assume another writer's style, and I don't know how you do that. I mean, it's like assuming somebody else's golf swing.
Well, if you ever got out of the house more and read my newspaper column, you would find out that the voice that I write in the newspaper isn't entirely dissimilar from him, and obviously he'd had there were guys who always influenced me. Pete Hamill did, Jimmy Breslin did, and the Spencer novels were a huge part of my young adulthood. And I just, once I read the first one, I said, oh my God, this guy's going to blow the doors off of everything. So I wasn't really, I wasn't trying to do an impression. I was trying to write in that spirit. I was trying to write in that attitude. And, and they were also very happy at Putnam that they knew we had been friends, that we had,
Yes.
we'd meet each other on book tours and we'd email constantly during the baseball season. He was a crazed Boston Red Sox fan, and a lot of that was before they started winning the World Series again. And so I honestly did feel like these characters and these voices had been in my head for 40 years. And again,
yes.
It just felt entirely... Joe, when I first wrote my first kids book, Taylor Lupica said to me afterwards, he said, honey, let's face it, you writing from inside the mind of a 12-year-old seems like pretty much a perfect thing. As far as
I would agree with that. But, now you're a well-established, like, Robert B. Parker writer. Fans accept you as that, which is truly no mean feat. Are there any other authors you want to take a crack at?
Joe Ide. IQ. I actually will be writing IQ 6.
Good luck with that.
IQ goes to New York City, and adventures ensue. No, this was
I don't believe you could do.
This was completely. It was like falling out of a tree and landing on my feet. I honestly, I did not ask the question thinking that somebody's going to say, "Oh, we'd like you to write a Sonny Randall novel," and they like Sonny, and now here I am, and it's been, even though you get the agonized emails from me, usually at about page 100, where I don't know where the hell.
Yes, I don't know why you even email me. Because no, I don't help you. You end up solving it yourself. I make a suggestion and you totally ignore it. I don't know if you noticed that.
I don't believe that's true. I believe that we have a lively exchange of thoughts when each of us is writing a book. And by the way, anybody who's watching this, Smoke is great. And what's great about Smoke is it's another huge step forward because it's different. This one's different. This is a different IQ at the start of this book, and wait till people get a load of this because he's, I hate, cause he's so mean to me, but I have to say these nice things about him. These books are dazzlingly good. I told him one time in a note that I paraphrased Raymond Chandler, and I said, Ide writes so good, he'd make a bishop want to kick a hole in a church window.
Ike, you have to stop now.
It's true.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Jesse Stone.
Okay.
Separate and apart from any particular book.
Mm-hmm.
What's he like? Why is he so beloved?
Because he's so, Spencer, for all of his smartass and for all of the relationship with Susan and the relationship with Hawk, Spencer's like a superhero. He's afraid of no one. He's like the it's the old John L. Sullivan line. I can lick any man in the house. Okay, that's Spencer. Jesse's different, and it was so interesting. The first Jesse Stone novel where he's pulling into paradise, and he's this wounded character. He has a drinking problem. He is, and throughout, I don't know what. I think this is the 19th book. He gets sober, he gets drunk. He gets sober, he gets drunk. Even though Joe says he doesn't help me, but every once in a while I'll bounce something off him. And there's a scene in this book where he wants a drink, and this came from an exchange we had. He wants a drink right effing now, and he pulls over, and so his alcoholism informs him, But what makes him interesting to me, and he had an on again, off again thing with his ex-wife Jen that I think finally played out. It was clear in the last Jesse that Bob Parker wrote that he loved the idea of Jesse and Sonny being together, because she came up and they were working on a case together. But the thing that informs him the most, at his lowest point, he knew he was a great cop. He's not just a good cop. He's a great cop. He drank himself out of robbery homicide in Los Angeles. The only people...
That contrast between this incredibly competent cop and his huge vulnerability.
Right.
I think that's a great character.
And there was some thought, at the end of the last book that Reed Coleman wrote, he had gone to, he's been to rehab now, okay? And now I'm thinking, okay, do I want to have him drink again? I like the daily fight to stay sober. That informs any recovering alcoholics.
I think that's key, especially with a serious character, that he's always fighting himself.
Yeah.
That's the major stumbling block to doing anything, solving the case, is himself, his own vulnerability.
Yeah, and it was funny, for book after book, as much as his drinking was a vulnerability, so was his relationship with his ex-wife, Jen. Right. And it was really that she became symbolically like the Bible. He quit her. He couldn't quit her. He'd stop for a while. She'd show up. They'd end up back together again. And and he would forgive her because she was willing to bed down anybody that she could get to stand still long enough. Okay.
That's
and
right.
So, and he was obsessed with her. He was obsessed with her the way he was with drinking. And now she's gone off and married somebody else. So it's Jesse alone. And then a lot of his former lovers have died. So there is Molly Crane in Fool's Paradise, his deputy and his best friend, says he's the alonest man I've ever met. And he, and at one point he tells
I think it's interesting that this good man is attracted to destructive women that are not good for him.
Right.
It's a very interesting dilemma, and I'm not sure if he's aware that these are the kinds of women he's drawn to.
Yeah, I'm not sure he is either. And what, again, it's all of these shadings that make him so interesting. Because the other thing, I always thought he was funny too. I mean, the dialogue between him and Molly and Sue. So I wanted to bring back that. And it's funny. I contemplated all of the flirtation that has gone on with him and Molly, book after book after book. She's happily married with 4 kids. One of the fun things in this book is I give Molly a much bigger part. I mean, there's a whole subplot with her and Sonny.
She's fun. She's fun all by herself.
She's great. And then she and Sonny, Jesse starts calling them Thelma and Louise. And they have a lot of fun talking about which one has the big, but one of the things I set out to do with this book is I've always loved Molly Crane, and it was like, she's been standing in the chorus for a long time, and I let her bust out a couple of solos in this book.
Great. Can I say something, Joe?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm speaking as a longtime fan, because I have read Parker in real time since the God Wolf manuscript. Mike, I think that Jesse is much more interesting not drunk at this point. I think he's much more interesting trying to stay sober. And I think, he's been on this kind of self-destructive course with women and booze since he got injured and his baseball dream got laid aside. He just never has quite gotten over it. And at some point, we went through this with Spencer and Susan, and eventually they reached a place where they could coexist, and it became less tiresome and more supportive. And I think the reader's patience wears out with somebody who never can get off the tick-tock between being drunk And
Well, but particularly with Jen, Barbara, the Jen thing went on, you know,
too long.
for forever. By the way, one of the fun things in the news, I'm about 2/3 of the way through the news, Sonny Randall. Um, just for my own twisted amusement, I put Jesse and Richie in the same room together for the first time.
Right.
But see, this was so
That's
Parker
right.
because, you know, Sonny and Richie is that same TikTok dynamic that he had with Spencer and Susan for a long time, and which he had with Jesse and Jen. And, you know, at some point, characters, I think, need to grow up and move on in some direction. You know, so I like
Yeah, it doesn't mean they won't have new dilemmas,
No,
but
not at all.
they get out of that rut.
So this was the first Jesse I've read in a while where I really liked Jesse, and I really enjoyed the book. And the humor was not marred by the self-destruction. You could appreciate the humor because you weren't watching suicide in front of you. So this is my reaction, but if it's of any interest to you, I'm offering it up.
No, it's Barbara, it's true. And Joe, you know, it was not by accident that the victim, and there's no spoiler here, it happens in the first, 10 pages of the book. The shooting victim that starts all of the action of the book, Jesse had met him at an AA meeting in Marshport the night before. And so a lot of the ethos of AA comes into this book. And Suits says to him, well, you met him, what's his name? And Jesse says, Paul. And Suits says, Paul what? And Jesse said, it doesn't work that way.
This is something else I wanted to ask you about, is that you write yourself into a corner. When Fool's Paradise starts, Jesse has nothing. He has nothing. He has no clues, no leads. He has nothing. And is this conscious on your part to put yourself in a position, or put Jesse in a position where there is no way, there is no path?
Well, you know, it's a bit of a turn on a locked door mystery. He's really literally in a locked room. But I just thought that, okay, I said no phone, no ID, no last name, okay? No missing person report filed. I was very lucky doing this book, Joe. A dear family friend of ours who lives in my mom and dad's neighborhood in Nashua, New Hampshire, is the police chief of Carlisle, Massachusetts. And I literally, he's up the street. My parents are in their 90s. He's awesome to him, okay? His name's John Fisher. I dedicated the book to him. And one day he said, what are you working on? I said, well, I'm just starting this book about this small town cop, police chief. And so, you know, every time I'd say, okay, all right, here's the big, nothing on him. And he said, well, you do this, 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 and this. And then Jesse goes to Florida. And slowly, he creates a profile of his victim. And being Jesse, he is not going to, he feels the connection because of their recovering alcohol. You know, they're both recovering it. And that is enough for it to become personal with him.
It's another appealing. It's another appealing quality about him, and he's incredibly relentless.
Yes.
He's quiet about it. You know, he doesn't make a lot of noise about it, but he is absolutely determined. And that sort of quiet strength. That's not flashy, and it's not a lot of guns and bombs and, leaping from tall buildings. That's really appealing about him.
When you started to write IQ, you obviously, I mean, you've given a physical description of it. You know, one of the things I always found fascinating about Elmore, my dear friend Elmore Leonard, was he gave you very little physical description. He wanted you to figure out what you thought a character looked like by the way he talked and acted. Okay, so
He'd introduce characters with 3 pages of dialogue, not say anything about who they were, what they looked like.
I know.
And you know exactly who the guy was.
You know exactly who the guy was. I said to him one time, well, who's Jack Foley? And on the side he goes, George Clooney. That was it. George Clooney. Okay, and it was difficult because Parker, when he has Spencer and Jesse intersect for the first time, when Jesse is on a case, and I had Tom Selleck in my head, and Tom Selleck in my head because he played him in all those TV movies. But Jesse wasn't nearly as big as Tom Selleck, you know.
No.
So now I've got this different, you know, but I don't really describe Jesse's physical appearance at all.
No, you don't.
Book.
You know,
So
it's funny that Jesse seems big. I mean, my picture of him is a big guy.
Yeah.
He's like, you know, 6'2", 220.
And by the way, that scene when he ends up in backstory when they're up in paradise and that was one of the first overlaps that I loved. Okay, and so in the second Sunny, I have a chapter where her case takes her up to paradise. So I put them back together because Split Image was the last Jesse Stone that Bob Parker wrote. And it was clear that in his head, Sonny had moved on from Richie, and he loved the dynamic of Jesse and Sonny. They had been together in other books. And so I you know, Barbara was just talking about this. I have no idea where that's going. But I like the fact that right now there's a little sanity in that relationship. And
Yes.
And they
There's such strong characters. Putting them together will be fun.
It is fun. It is fun, and I know that you will be there for me as usual as I continue in the writing of Sunny 3.
Okay, you ignore me, but we'll move on from there. I can't. Tell you something.
Ignore me? Do you ignore me?
Well, yeah, but we know that. That's, you know, that's sort of the basis, one of the bases of our relationship. But I'll write something. I mean, I'll answer a question, and then I read the book, and there's nothing in it. There's nothing in it I said or suggested.
Well,
it's this sort of, I don't know why you called me.
It's part of the create. Well, first of all, I like to talk to you, and second of all, it's anybody who's seen me do these things before. I'm not the guy who goes up the hill and writes the book and doesn't talk to anybody. I like getting, you know this. I like getting input. I'll call my editor. I'll call you, and I'll say, okay, I got this and this and this, and you know, it's like the old Yogi Berra line. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay, I just feel like I come to all these forks in the road, and I don't know which one to take. And so sometimes just talking about it, and I'm not looking to ignore your very fine advice, talking it through then helps me. You know, there's always a point. I don't know where it comes for you. It's usually about 100 pages with me, where I say, okay, it's like when you're doing one of those 500-piece puzzles, okay?
Yes.
You've got all of these pieces. Taylor Lupica, she's a great puzzle doer, okay? And she will literally say to me, get away from the table. I don't touch anything when I walk away, okay? And I said, but I feel like I can help, honey. She says, no, you can't help. But I'll feel like I'm looking down one of those boards, but I feel like I've just got the corners. Right. And then I think, oh God, sometimes I've got, you get too many possibilities of where you want to take your story.
It's interesting how different we are. I don't want to talk to anybody.
Yeah, but you don't want to talk to anybody ever.
Well, yeah, but writing too, I don't want to talk to anybody.
That's not really true.
I think
Joe talks to me. I mean, come on. I'm not going to let him sit here some sort of misanthrope. He's very good about talking. He just doesn't want to talk.
No, he's not a misanthrope, Barbara. He's a recluse. He's a recluse.
Okay. Well, that's true.
He doesn't.
I mean, I don't want to talk about how to solve a writing problem.
Right.
That I don't want to talk about it.
Right. So guys, can we go back to Spencer a moment? Because if you remember, and I read it more than one Spencer, and I can't tell you which book it is, but Spencer's basic investigative technique when he got a case was just to go out and start poking. You know, he went out and knocked a few things around and waited for a reaction. It wasn't like he had some kind of, procedural outline or anything. He just went out and, banged around and waited for things to happen. and that was his style. And I don't think that Jesse is really that different, at least not in this book. He has nothing to work with, right? So what does he do? He starts poking around, banging around a little bit. Maybe I'll go to Florida. The premise is, for him, as I understood it in this book, that because Paul was in AA with him and was proud of the fact that they had both stopped drinking, that it was unlikely he would have committed suicide. He just wasn't in a place where, having overcome the drinking, that he was suddenly going to kill himself. That was what he had to work with, right? And the fact that he went and took an Uber or whatever it was to the gate of this mansion. Why? And those are the only two things that Jesse knows, right?
Right.
And so he's not completely without a map. He's kind of like down at the bottom with roads to go and forks, as you say, when I come to a fork, take it. But that's where he starts, with a psychological profile of Paul, essentially, based upon his own feeling that he's quit drinking, and therefore he's not going to go off the rails. So if that's true for him, it should be true for Paul. At least that's what I think you said.
Well, what the thing about Jesse though is he gets and this is an old Parker expression. He starts pulling on strings, okay, and
yes,
and it's there's a skill in that. Again, it's just like a piece at a time. He puts together this man's identity a piece at a time, and then he finds out, there's little things that he said, and then he finds out that he was left in a dumpster as a baby, and there's a cool nun in the book, and he worked in the horse business. I did enjoy getting him out of paradise. I wanted to expand his world a little bit, but I think he's pretty enterprising in this thing. I think starting with nothing and finally figuring out who this man was, I thought was he's a cop. It's his cop DNA. It's something that was the rock solid foundation of who he is, even in his worst times. And Spencer, Sonny's the same way. To her idea of detecting sometimes is to go annoy someone, or go or go follow someone, or find some way to poke the bear. And Jesse's
she's very much like that.
Yeah, she is.
Well, she'll just go and stir something up, not knowing what really she's looking for. But if she's annoying enough and determined enough, something will happen, and it does. Is there something else I want to ask you? Do you think Jesse Stone would like you?
Yes. Yes, I do. I obviously we wouldn't have a drink together, but yes. And by the way, what's your inference there? Let me turn that question around. Why wouldn't he like me?
Lots of reasons.
Did we not hit it off when we met in Southern California that day?
Yes, we did.
Despite the fact that you were ridiculing everything, including my breakfast order.
You mean the kelp sandwich?
It wasn't a kelp sandwich. It was an egg white omelet. It was an egg omelet.
Same thing. I'm just wondering. Like I think about that with Isaiah, my own character. Would he like me?
Yes, because here's why. And this blurs the line between fiction and reality. He'd think, I have to like him. He may annoy me sometimes, but I have to like him because he also created Dotson. And anybody who created Dotson, who's enriched his life in ways good and bad, he'd have to like that guy.
I always thought that we were, IQ and myself, were too isolated, we're too insular, that there's not hardly anybody I actually want to be friends with. And, it's you and like two other people. And that's
enough, right?
It's a short list. It's the same with IQ. he's so insulated. I don't know. I think we would ignore each other or walk past each other.
I'm going to tell you something.
You're hard not to notice.
Nah. Okay.
Jesse would like you. He would like you.
Okay, listen to this. What you just said reminded me of one of my favorite Hollywood stories that has nothing to do with literature, but you'll like this story. Okay?
Okay.
A friend of mine was friends with Fred Astaire. And my friend Alan was out in Los Angeles, and he was going to have dinner at Fred Astaire's house. And he goes to lunch that day, and he runs into the actress Janice Rule, who's an old friend. And he said, listen, I'm going to Fred's house tonight for dinner. I'll call him, and you can come with me. And she said, great. Alan calls Fred Astaire, and he says, listen, I ran into Janice Rule. She used to be married to Ben Gazzara. And I told her, it's okay if she comes to dinner, right? And Fred Astaire says, no, Alan, it's not.
Wow.
And Alan said, why? And Fred Astaire said, Alan, I'm 82 years old and I know enough people. Is that a great story?
That's exactly my attitude.
That's what touched off that memory.
It's you meet somebody rare, like Barbara, for example. And it's really hard not to like her, not to be attracted to her. She's a very compelling person. But those kinds of people are very rare, extremely rare. And it's always a pleasure to meet somebody like Barbara. I mean, lots of people
who's as passionate about what she does as anybody we know in our world.
I think she knows more about your book than you do.
She knows a lot about my book.
You mean as I argue that actually Jesse did start somewhere? He didn't have nothing. He had a belief, he had a profile of who Paul might be. And that's where he started. And I love that. I don't like you saying he started with nothing, because he actually did have something, And he's so stubborn. And he didn't want to let go of it. It fuels his way all the way through the book. So,
Barbara, let me ask you a question, since you do know these books so well. And again, this really doesn't spoil anything. When the bullet goes through Jesse's window, when he's the old shortstop makes an error and drops a ball that saves his life, did you think, and I'm not telling anything about my story, did you at that moment assume that was part of Paul's murder?
I thought it was up for grabs because there was other stuff going on, which we won't go into, because there's more than one thing that Jesse is involved in. And so that was an ambiguous act in the sense that it could have been one thing and it could have been another thing. And, it's very hard in one of these books to have just one single straight line or wobbly line, as the case may be, investigation. And so, and let's face it, in a real cop's life, did either of you ever hear of the author Del Shannon, whose real name was Elizabeth Langdon?
No.
Probably not. Okay,
no.
So she was one of my mother's favorite authors, and in the Library of Congress Classic Crime Series that we have brought back, Poison Pen Press, one of her books, her First Lieutenant Luis Mendoza of the LAPD, is one of those books. And the thing that was interesting about Luis Mendoza, aside from the fact that he was an Hispanic cop in Los Angeles and the hero of a long police procedural series at a time when that was very rare, was that he always had at least 3 or 4 cases on the boil. He never had because cops don't. They're working different investigations. And she was always a master at having several go on, and there was always like a pull-through case, one that started at the beginning, and that was the one you were following to the end. But along the way, there were always other investigations, and so things would become confused. You weren't sure that something happened, whether it was relevant to the main case or a side case. And that I thought you did that really well in this book, because at least two things going on lead you're not sure what's what part of the time, and that makes it more interesting.
Well, Barbara, again, I keep referencing Split Image because that was my favorite Jesse, and it was the last one he wrote. But he often, in those books, had 2 things going on. And it's a great writing challenge, but once you realize that this is the way it would be. Rarely do these guys get to drop everything, especially with a 12-man police department, which is all he's ever had in Paradise. So I loved having two things. I knew I was going to have two things going on. I didn't know at the start that I was going to bring some people out of the past, but it just felt like the right thing to do.
So, Joe, isn't that true?
Go ahead, Barbara.
I was just going to say, isn't that true of Isaiah? I mean, you don't have him just doing one thing.
Oh.
Even though he's,
No.
he's not an official law enforcement guy, but I mean, he's in there with lots of things going on, which makes the books. What is they call it? Texture? Isn't that the sort of literary word for all this when you're writing? You texture it.
Yeah, I don't know what the word is for it. It has a lot to do with the way I write. I have an idea and some characters, and I write wherever they go.
Right.
And it's inevitably not one story.
No, it really isn't.
And I'm interested mostly in character. I can make up a plot, but it's the characters and their backstories, how they got to this brink, and how they became who they are. That's the most fascinating thing for me about writing it. I don't really know that until I write it.
I'm going to say something nice to him again, because because anybody who hasn't read these books, you have to read these books. But the first, 30 pages of the first one, where he rescues that girl, is like a master class in you're only telling us a part of this person, but that moment and all the things he sees and all of that Sherlock Holmes-ness of him, that it finally has him saving this young girl from this pervert. Okay, it's like a master class, and it's masonry. You've laid this foundation, and then everything that happens in a way makes sense because of everything we learned about him in the first 30 pages. I mean, we're going to learn a lot more about him, but the first 30 pages of that book, you say, oh, okay. And that story really has no bearing on the stuff that, a little bearing, but it has.
I knew I was, when you write a crime novel, you are getting into a highly competitive field. And there's a finite number of dollars in the market. And when you bring in, if you're a new book, you're taking dollars away from Mike Lupica and somebody else. And so you've really got to make a statement. I wrote the first chapter, rewrote it 26 times.
Wow.
Because I knew I would be in the arena with you and Grisham and Michael Connelly and all the other great crime writers.
I'm not in that. I'm in a side room. I'm like in a lounge next to the main room. I want to ask you another IQ question, okay? Because we had agreed this would be a conversation, right?
Yes, we did. I'm sort of regretting that now, but yes, go ahead.
How did you spend time in Vegas, and how much for Righteous, or did you just go off of what you already knew about Vegas?
No, I didn't go to Vegas. It's mostly previous trips there and my reactions to it.
Because it's so, as Bill Goldman used to say, the Vegas stuff in that book, it's as authentic as dust on a library book. That was one of his big expressions, dust on a library book. And it's just, and again, there's another book. That book, there's all kinds of shit going on in that book.
There is. I'll tell you why I know Vegas so well, or as well as I do. My mother loved Vegas.
Did she?
She loved Vegas. She sewed special pockets into her pants for quarters.
Yeah.
She was afraid somebody would steal them.
Yeah.
And it was one of the few places where she felt safe. I mean, inside a casino is about as safe as you can be.
Right.
And she had all of her favorite machines, and she loved buffets. She ate like a bird, and she grew up in the 30s, so she was always worried about the next meal. And the four brothers would take her to Vegas, and she would send us up to the buffet to steal, she says, desserts. And we'd bring them back to her, and she would put them in special plastic bags and secret them away in her pants and her purse. And she loved Vegas, so we took her all the time. No, my brothers liked the place, but I didn't.
The Vegas stuff is great in that book. It's great.
So Patrick is here, and I'm going to segue over to him for questions. But before I do, I forgot to have our commercial break and mention that Mike has found the books that we sent to him in his basement and has signed them. And,
Oh, no.
Sorry, I know, I couldn't resist. Anyway, our autographed copies of Fool's Paradise are speeding on their way to us, and we still have a few unclaimed copies. So be sure that you grab one. And we'll put up Joe's new book for February 23rd on our website so you can pre-order it, because we always run out. So it's a really good idea to order early and order often, which is not to be confused with vote early and often, which seems to be a new mantra going around. But order early and often is our deal. So Patrick, have you got any comments or questions over here from fans?
Just a few. Okay, Mike, Tom asks, when you write about Jesse, do you picture Tom Selleck like we all do?
No, I was talking about that before. I did, and I have to tell myself that if you read when Spencer first sets eyes on him in Backstory, when he and Hawk are up in paradise trying to kidnap basically a gangster's daughter, okay? His description is a guy, I picture him now about 5'10", you know, and Selleck, now all you can see Selleck is Frank Reagan in Blue Bloods. You know, he looks like a tight end with all the other characters, but in my mind now, I do picture, I picture him as a good-looking guy, a sort of slender guy, but he's a little smaller than Mr. Selleck.
Well, let me ask Joe, how do you picture IQ? Is he big, small? What?
He's 6 feet tall. He's thin, and he's sort of a young Denzel.
Okay,
That's how I've always pictured him.
great.
He does not stand out in appearance. There's a line in the book that says, you know, you pick him third for pickup basketball.
It's a great line. It's a great line.
It is a great line.
Okay, I have a question actually for both of you, which is the basic question you'd get, which is, what is your writing process, and what or who inspired you to be an author?
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell this story, and Joe, don't make fun of my writing table like you always do, okay?
Okay.
I have an unusual writing process. I write longhand before I type, and I will write 20 or 30 pages. It's the little Catholic, in my little Catholic schoolboy handwriting. And it all started, this is more answer than you know. My first novel was, first mystery novel I wrote back in the 80s on an Olivetti typewriter. And I was finishing the book in the summer, and I had rented a house with some buddies, and they're always upstairs sleeping it off in the morning when I wanted to be finishing my novel. So I couldn't be clacking away. And the only way to advance my book was to start writing on yellow pads. And all of a sudden, I just felt like I thought better with my pen. You know, Elmore Leonard did the same thing. He wrote, but he'd write 5 or 10 pages and then type. I'll sometimes get so far behind, I piss myself off because the typing. But when I put it in to the laptop, it's like a second draft. So usually when I send copy to my editor, it's cleaner than it normally would be, because, like, you know, wait, this is not a prop, but, you know, this is, you see this? This is part of today's output, okay? And I used to write on legal pads, and Mr. Leonard said, why do you worry about staying within the lines? Don't worry about that. Get blank pages. And I've been writing on them ever since. And but as a former newspaper columnist, and I'll just turn this over to Joe, I'm conditioned to write in 1,000-word bursts. I've been writing newspaper columns my whole adult life. So that doesn't feel like a lot of work to me. But,
Wow.
but Joe, you know, 4 or 5, 1,000 words a day is 5,000 words a week. It's 20,000 a month, and they start to accumulate, and
That's a lot of
so I
words.
can write a book in 4 months, or 4.5 months, or 5 months.
I've never written 5,000 words in a day ever.
Yeah.
I have to be completely isolated. My study is soundproof anyway, but I wear earplugs, so I can just be completely detached from the rest of the world. I have to be, if I'm writing about Isaiah, I am Isaiah.
Right.
I am there, and I'm doing what he's doing. And it's the process that I really love.
Right.
When you're just in it, you're just totally in it, and you're not looking over your shoulder, you're not kibitzing, you're just there. And I value that process. And I regret that I get tired and I have to get up and eat something. And like you, like most of the writers we know, we're obsessive. There's no question when you get up in the morning you're going to write. There's just no question.
It's just a question of when you're going to start. And there's, I don't know, are you able to put it off for a while, or do you, like, some mornings I'll get up and get right after it, and other mornings I'll be sitting at this table and think, okay, you've done everything that you can do to not write now. You've cleared the decks. You need to write something. By the way, Joe has one of the great answers to a question that you often get, and they'll say, do you ever get writer's block? And Mr. Ide, I asked him that question once, and he said, writer's block means you got up from the desk. And it's one, I've got it written down on my corkboard here. Writer's block basically means you quit that day. I refuse to quit that day if I'm stuck. I don't want to wake up the next morning and start stuck. And even if I will write through it, even not sure that this is what I'm going to use, but I don't want to be up staring at a wall the next day. That's why I'll sometimes, you hear this, quit when you're going good, because I know, like I did that today, I know exactly where I'm going to pick up in the morning.
There's just always something you can write. Always. It may not be, excuse me, that's the FedEx man. Yeah, I'm here, man.
Why isn't the puppy barking at the FedEx man?
He's asleep.
Okay.
Which is a good thing.
Right.
I can't believe that happened. I don't know what I was talking about.
Yeah, but you know what? You're obviously not in your soundproof room if you heard the freaking FedEx.
No, I have to leave the door open for the dog.
Okay. And here's the other thing about writing. And when I knew Elmore Leonard, and I was lucky enough to know him the last 25 years of his life. I wrote an Esquire piece about him, and we became friends, and we stayed friends, and we played tennis. And I used to have my publisher send me through Detroit just so I could go hang with him for a couple of days. Because he was, as I've told you, he was everything you think he was. He was that cool. And there would be days when I would finally be ready to pack it in, say, at 4 o'clock. And I hadn't quite gotten to where I wanted to go that day. And I said, you know what? And I'd say to my wife, I'm going back down the hill. At our old house, we used to have this little writing cottage for me in Connecticut. And she said, why? I said, because there's an 85-year-old guy in outside of Detroit, and I know he's still working. And I said, if he can still be there, I can still be there.
Patrick, anything?
You have the best stories. It's incredible, really, truly. The breadth of your experience and the people you know always blows me away.
So,
I'm
sorry, Barbara, I interrupted you.
Wait, Barbara, I used to call Dutch and late in the day when I know he was finally wrapping up, and I'd say the following. And this one, he's like 86 years old. I'd say, are you writing or thinking about girls? And he'd giggle and he'd say, what, you can't do both?
I love that. So, Mike, you sent me an email in which you mentioned a few other projects. Because one of the questions that often comes up is, what are you doing in the pandemic? Do you have more time or less time? Can you concentrate better? And I noticed that you've got a book for middle graders coming out called Triple Threat, right?
It came out. Yeah, it came out a couple weeks ago, Barbara.
Okay. And then you've also written a book with James Patterson due out in 2021. What's that about?
It is about the world of riding, show jumping, elite show jumping. And it's a family drama about a grandmother, a mother who rides, and her 20-year-old daughter who rides. And the mother thinks she's on her way to the Olympics, and there's a groom with some immigration problems and a trainer, and it kind of came out of a breakfast that Jim and I had, and it turned into one of the most enjoyable experiences of we did not know each other before we started the book. We lived pretty close to each other when we were in Florida, and getting inside his head and seeing his the way he works and thinks, it was like I found out pretty quickly why he is who he is, and his sense of story and pushing stories forward at a breakneck speed. It really was like a masterclass in storytelling. And we finished it a couple months ago, and I just got the edits back, and I'm going to work on those next week.
Sounds wonderful. And the other thing you mentioned, which we did a wonderful event with Carl Hyacin and John Sanford, because they were both at the Miami Herald at the end of the 70s, along with Edna Buchanan. I mean, it was like a crackerjack, team in Miami. And Squeeze Me is the book. And I noticed that you said that you think it's Carl's funniest book. So tell us why.
It's just, well... It's very difficult to describe, except let me just say this, Barbara. The President of the United States in this book is someone you may recognize a little bit, and Carl's rendering of him, and the First Lady, and as usual, the Pete Hamill, God rest his soul, used to say, Carl should not be allowed to drive a car or vote or be left alone for very long. But he is one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. And this book, it's set in Palm Beach, and Hyacin in Palm Beach. It's almost like sometimes you think, wait, this is too easy for him. But as usual, his stuff, as crazy as it is, sometimes he has trouble keeping up with the craziness that is actually occurring in his home state.
Well, I can't argue with that. I think of Carl as the Jonathan Swift of our time.
Yes.
I think
yes.
of Palm Beach in this book
so
as the island of Lilliput. I really do. I mean, I think it is brilliant. I mention this because we still have autographed copies of Carl signed by Carl. But even if we didn't, I would still like to recommend the book because, it is hard to make any sense out of where we are at the moment. And so maybe Carl's approach to it is really the sanest of all.
And let me say the magic word about this book without spoiling anything. The magic word in any Hyacin book, skink. Okay, I'll just leave you with that.
I like that very much.
I'll remember that.
Right. Guys, it's really been a pleasure. Is there any last thing you'd like to nail each other with?
No, I'm very respectful of I'm very respectful of people that I think are superior talents to me, and so I'm just happy. Barbara, I'm just happy that Mr. Ide takes my phone calls.
Yes, I am too. So we're united in that. Mr. Ide, it's always a pleasure to see you. I can't wait for February.
Thank you.
My plan is to somehow get you here from Los Angeles, unless it's going to be such a health hazard we can't do it. But
I'll be there.
Well, honestly, guys, it's really been a pleasure. I really enjoyed the Sonny Randall, Mike, and I thought this was the most enjoyable Jesse Stone I've read in a very long time. I really like the path that you're on. And I do think there's more humor than Bob had in his late books. And so I really like that. You've got the good parts of Parker, But I like the fact that right at the moment when we need more good nature and more humor in our lives, I thought that you did a wonderful job presenting that.
But now, Barbara, you think Jesse would have liked me, don't you? Tell Joe that. You think Jesse would have liked me, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I think,
Well, that wasn't very enthusiastic.
No, I'm sorry. The reason I said that lukewarmly, I remember, did I tell you my favorite Bob Parker story? I might have. But, we used to meet for drinks at the Biltmore. And I grew up in Chicago, so my family are Cubs fans. And of course, Bob was a Red Sox fan, so we were both on, a long and depressing trail. And we used to sit there, and I would say to him, do you think either of us will ever live long enough to see our team win? And then we'd say, no, because we're both getting older, right? And it just didn't seem. So in that last season, when the Red Sox made their run, you never want to jinx it. It's like, you never want to talk about a no-hitter in the eighth inning or something. So I would write to Bob and he would write to me, but we would never mention the Red Sox. But as the series went on and we finally got to the last game, I went down the hall to my office and I opened up my email and I wrote to Bob. And I said, dear Bob, we've lived long enough. And back came an answer. Now this is Robert Parker, master of the repartee, master of dialogue, and all. Here's his return message. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, no punctuation, love, Bob. And I always think of him that way. It was just such a wonderful reaction. It was a real pleasure to know him. I think Bob liked you, and therefore I think Jesse definitely would like you.
Thanks, Barbara.
And I think he would really have liked Isaiah too. So anyway, guys, it's been a rare pleasure. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. See you soon.
Thank you, Mom.
You bet.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thanks for doing this, Joe.
Yeah, by all means.